I think it's interesting how you both answered this question from different perspectives. Julian, what I heard, you were talking more about internal processes, as in how are colonized peoples processing what happened to them themselves and how are they moving forward themselves. And Emily, I heard you more about externalities, as in between colonized peoples and from the perpetrators to the colonized peoples. And obviously, both are true. Both are both are realities that we deal with from an individual, psychologically, from an individual level, kind of making analogies to a whole group of people. When individuals are traumatized, they sometimes carry forward that trauma um, that they suffered, and they perpetrate violence onto others sometimes, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they internalize it and they feel bad about themselves. And maybe societies act in similar ways, where sometimes if a society or a community has been traumatized or victimized, then they might traumatize and victimize others. This is not to make any excuses for anyone or justifications, but it's very complicated, obviously, when people have been subject to violence, not just once or twice, but over decades and centuries. And yes, internal work needs to be done, obviously, but then there is a historical context, right? So, for example, here in the Americas and in Australia and New Zealand and other settler nations, resources were taken away from people, right? It wasn't just damage done to the people themselves. Their connections to land were severed. Their identities were tried to be harmed. They were displaced. They were annihilated in some cases. What does one do with that? Because for example, I was trying to read all 500 and whatever 65 pages of the Truth and Reconciliation report, the executive summary of the Government of Canada, and there are 94 action items. And I read the titles and the content of each of them. Not a single one of them is titled reparations, right? There's a lot about, sports and community programs and this and that. But what does one do uh, with that? Because if European nations and the United States and Canada had to actually make reparations, whatever that would look like, because money can't compensate for having taken your whole land away, right? What does that even look like? So I don't even know where that begins, to be honest. And I know many people write about it. I know many people discuss it. But do you have any thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, you could write entire libraries. I mean, like many of the books behind me would probably get at like small fractions of that subject. I think that there's lots of pieces to this. I mean, I guess I would start where I left off and just say that, a huge part of what was taken was ultimately our culture, our language, our community and family life, our connection to our land. And I think that in the broadest sense, in the wake of this history, from if the POV is primarily indigenous, then the action is to reclaim. If the primary agent is indigenous peoples, then I don't think we would think about it in terms of repair. I think we would think about it as taking back. And because I don't know if we're actually even that interested in like repairing our relationship with, the colonial government or the Catholic Church, for example. That's a generational question depending on who you ask, but that's my own perspective. And then I think then there's a question of what if what was taken cannot just literally be given back, the land, for example, and then more um, less tangible things like your sense of cultural pride and identity. What is the value at the end of the day of a language, for example? I think then there's a question of should we be interested in some form of recompense? And actually, in many instances, the answer seems to be no. So, for example, in the United States, There is a long-standing Supreme Court decision in favor of the Lakota people's rightful claim to their sacred Black Hills. The settlement of that now totals in the billions because it has collected interest over time. And to this day, despite the fact that the Lakota are the poorest people in the United States, they live in the poorest places in this country, they continue to refuse to accept that settlement money because they insist the Black Hills are not for sale. And there's a very similar legal situation in British Columbia where the entire province, except for a few exceptions, was taken without any treaty or other form of legal or economic recompense. And, the vast majority of First Nations have not settled that land question with the United States, or sorry, with Canada or the province of British Columbia, because we insist that the land is unceded and remains ours. And we have no intention to relinquish our rightful hereditary legal claim to it. In some instances, because we philosophically do not believe uh, that there can be a monetary value assigned to the places that our ancestors and supernatural forces and all these sorts of things come from. Um, of course, there are differences. There are some people who do want to accept money for those sorts of things. I know many of them. And, I think that the last piece of this also ultimately, and I guess this would bring me to a relationship between uh, colonized peoples sorts of question, is what is the value of being proud of who you are? What is the value of seeing value in yourself, in your identity and your culture? Because fundamentally, that was one of the things that was taken from our people through the schools. And I think one of the things that you finally see, um, particularly young indigenous peoples, starting to reclaim through a connection to spirituality, songs, dances, all that sort of stuff. And I think in many instances, reclaiming that by looking at other oppressed and colonized communities and seeing the way that they represent their identity and their culture and their pride, despite histories of colonization and discrimination and oppression and slavery and all that sort of stuff. And I think that uh, often that was done in dialogue with Black culture and the Black community and also the broader colonized world. And in a place like Surrey, British Columbia, that I brought up earlier, one thing that you do see a lot is people from the subcontinent outside, like very visibly representing their religion, their culture, their who they are, in an otherwise, very white dominated country, Canada, and doing that in a way that signals a sense of identity and pride that I think, I know other Native people look at and go like, if they come here and feel comfortable, representing who they are and where they come from, why don't we do the same thing? Why don't we do the same thing? And I think um, that can sound aesthetic and minimal, but actually, if you were a little Indian kid who came from very little and felt different and felt less than in school and in your community context and all that sort of stuff. To have that sense of pride, that sense that you can belong, that you can, be um, a whole person in society and not have to hide who you are, it can be an incredibly empowering thing and can actually transform the kinds of uh, outcomes that you might end up in life. I mean, it can in some instances, be a life or death kind of can mean the difference between, ending up on the streets and ending up doing something with your life, which is, that's huge.
Emily, did you want to weigh in on my follow-up?
I think Julian handled that one really beautifully.
All right. Thanks.